chapter's assistive technologist. My boss likes to call me the Gidget and Gadget girl, and that's what I'm here to talk about. What are the communication options available to somebody who opts for ventilation? So as Dr. Gregory mentioned, we simply never know if somebody's going to be able to talk after the tracheostomy procedure. Even if you could talk prior to going into the surgery, you might not be able to talk afterwards. The problem when you're considering ventilation that we run into with getting devices funded by insurance is that unless there's an existing medical need for a communication device, unless there's something called dysarthria, which is slurred speech, prior to going into the ventilation process and the surgery, there's no medical need to pay for it. So even though you're electing to say, yes, I want to be on a ventilator and I'm concerned I'm not going to be able to talk, insurance doesn't pay for future needs, they pay for current needs. So even though we want to be proactive, you can't be proactive if there's not a medical need. Okay? So sometimes what ends up happening is you have to go through the procedure and then we have to see what happens afterwards. So the decisions that somebody needs to make with communication options, how do you want to communicate? But the most important thing that I've heard, I've been here 16 years, so I've heard a lot, I've been asked a lot, but well, what's the right way to do it? And the answer is there is no right way. You do it however you feel comfortable. Some people will opt for low technology, and I gave everyone, I'll go over these in a little bit, but letter boards or picture boards or writing if they still have the hand dexterity to do so. Some people will choose high technology using computers, iPads, iTouches, and then some people will go for the communication devices that are paid for under insurance. But what I have found in my experience is that people use all of these. They use multiple modalities to communicate. If they're in bed, they might choose one way. If they're in the living room in their wheelchair, they're going to use another way. I can tell you what's available, but I don't live in your world. So you kind of have to figure it out as you go along. So this is what Dr. Gregory talked about a little earlier. When most people remember when Christopher Reeve, after he sort of stabilized and started doing interviews, his ventilator would take a breath and he would talk on the exhale, if you all remember that. He was using what's called a passive Muir valve, a one-way valve. Okay? The valve is placed on the end of the trachea right there. You need to be able to speak on the exhale. And as Dr. Gregory talked about, around the tube is a cuff. That cuff has air in it. In order for a passive Muir to work, you have to deflate the cuff. Some people cannot tolerate not having air in that cuff, and so therefore they can't use the passive Muir valve. You never know that until you try. Each facility that I've run into has a different mechanism of trying a passive Muir valve. Sometimes hospitals will leave it up to the speech therapy department, and some hospitals will leave it up to the respiratory therapy department. Some hospitals will automatically try it after a ventilation process, and some will never try it unless you ask. So know that the option is there. But there was a study that was done with passive Muir valves and ALS patients, and they statistically averaged about 6 months of time using the passive Muir valve, and then they had to move on to another form of technology. Okay. So what do we do if you can't speak? And this is if you're in the hospital or if you're just not technology proficient. You use low technology, you use letter boards like this. Sorry, I didn't have any lamination at home, but you can laminate these with contact paper so they don't get wet. Okay, there's 2 different types of boards that I distributed, and they come in all different sizes. This is just a small one. I keep this in my day timer, so I always have something around. Could I use you? Do you mind? Okay. If we were starting a communication system, and you are Sally, okay. And what Sally and I would do is I would tell her, okay, Sally, I want you to nod, a small nod when I'm right, okay? no when I'm not, okay? Or if she can't nod, thumb up, thumb down, eyebrow up, or look left, look right, whatever the person has. So if I was trying to ask Sally, okay, what state were you born in? Okay, and we're gonna use a letterboard. This is a double-sided letterboard. And what I hear all the time from people is, I can't use a letterboard because I can't point. So the idea is called partner-assisted scanning. So I would say to Sally, for example, if you were born in Alaska, what I would do is say, is it row 1? And then A, and she would nod. That's exactly, so already I would know that she was starting with A. And you know, my geography can kick in and I'd say, okay, Alabama, Alaska, whatever. But okay, so what state were you born in? Is it row 1? Row 1A? Oh, wow. Tell me it's not Alaska. No. And then we would move on to the next letter. And we've established a communication system immediately. I tell people keep these in a drawer, keep them at home all the time because you never know when you're going to need one. And the nice thing about letterboards too is with most people, and you've heard it already and you're going to hear it from Sue and Melissa, you get a lot of different people in your home, caregivers that aren't your family that may not be able to talk to your person with ALS, but always have one of these available. And it seems rather, I'm sorry, I stole that, Lindsay. It seems rather simplistic, but always have a yes and no system in place. I'm always surprised when I go out and I'll do a home visit and say, well, how does this person say yes? Some people say 2 blinks is yes, and then the other family member will say, no, 1 blink is yes. So I put it on a piece of loose leaf and I put it on the wall. Joe says yes, bye. But I personally, after all these years, I hate blinks. I really do. I think they're unreliable. And what you will sometimes see with advanced ALS is a real lazy blink. They'll do this. Well, imagine doing that to answer a question every day. So I'm going to pick on you again. But I would say to Sally, look this way for yes. I'm watching her eyes and I see it. Look this way for no. Maybe. Yes and no stinks, especially if I've asked the question wrong. If I said to Sally, do you want to go outside? I've given her a yes or a no answer. Well, what if she says not if it's raining? That's a maybe. Okay? Yes, no, maybe. In fact, last night I was on iTunes for the iPad, and there's an app, a yes and no app, but there's no maybe on there. And it drives me crazy, because if I've asked the question wrong, I'm making that person conform to my answer. And so always have a yes, no, maybe. The use of laser pointers, which you can buy anywhere, Walmart, Staples. The laser pointers I use are actually for, I'm sorry, I didn't have one to bring, but they're actually for boar hunting rifles. So they're really thin, they're about the size of a pen. They're $39 at Walmart in the hunting section. And when you turn it on, it stays on all day. So if I have the ability to hold it in my hand, I can, or I can put it on my head and I can be using the laser pointer just to move around the red dot. If you don't want to use this, put it on a piece of poster board and put it on the wall. And they can be talking to you across the room. Okay. And at one of my last slides, there's some great YouTube videos, and there's one of somebody using a laser pointer to communicate. That's his option to communicate, and he loves it. So a lot of what I talk about is hard for people to conceptualize, and I do direct people to YouTube all the time. And if you just go to YouTube and do a search under ALS and communication, you can find all of this. So these are just what I just showed you and mentioned. This one's a magic doodle that you can buy in the toy store, write on and wipe off. Okay. The advent of the iPad has revolutionized assistive technology. There's all kinds of apps on the iPad. Now this is actually an iPad 2, but I have a heavy-duty case. It's called a military case around it. So it hopefully helps if you drop it and it won't shatter. If you shatter an iPad screen, you might as well buy a new iPad because it's not covered under any of the Apple warranties. And then there's actually a cover on it that makes it water resistant. It adds a little weight, but you might want to think about that because it really does prevent it from being damaged. There's lots of communication apps available for the iPad. It depends on what you want to do. But
Hello.
Basically, you get type and talk apps. There's apps with pictures. There's apps that you can save phrases on. Lots of different apps. You can do the same thing on an iTouch or an iPhone. The iTouch and the iPhone, though, require, it's the heat of your finger that makes activation. Whereas the iPad, you can actually use a stylus on the iPad. So, you can have contracted hands and fingers and still be using the iPad. It's also a lot bigger than the iPhone. But I'm going to pass it around. You can play with it. There's all the apps on there already. And then you can use netbooks, full-size computers, to communicate if you have hands or not. Because there's free software that you can download into an existing computer to get it to speak for you. Okay. This is This is an example of eVentriloquist, which I actually have on my computer. I'm happy to show somebody later. But this is free. So you can save phrases, you can save sentences, you can save what they call quick fires. So when I hit F1, it'll say, hello, how are you? So if you have an existing computer and you're in the hospital, you're not feeling well, and you need something to communicate with right away, you can bring your own thing in. You can, if you have an iTouch or an iPad, you can bring that in too. Okay. But then some people want the high end. They want what I'll talk about, eye gaze units. They want their insurance to pay for a communication device. And as we talked about, there has to be a medical need first. Okay. And then Medicare has set up a process of how to get devices paid for. And even if you don't have Medicare, most private insurances will follow the Medicare guidelines. So this is true of Aetna or Blues or whatever else you might be carrying, that they're going to require a formal communication assessment. The speech pathologist has to document what device has been selected. The physician has to sign off on it. Obviously, insurance has to pay for it, and then there has to be some training and follow-up. I tell most people this is a 3 to 4 month process. Okay? It does not happen overnight. What can happen overnight is the mainstream technology, but insurance does not march to the beat of our drummer. They march to the beat of their own, so they take a while. So in order to get insurance to fund one, you have to see a speech pathologist that has a CCC certification. And this is often sometimes real difficult to find a pathologist that is familiar with communication devices. But you need to pick somebody who understands what your needs are, who also understands ALS. So there are some searchable locations on the website to find a local therapist. We do assessments at Pennsylvania Hospital. So if you come to our clinic, and even if you're not affiliated with our clinic, you can still come for an assessment. So the therapist has to ask all these questions that may be redundant, but it is a Medicare guideline that you have to ask all those questions. They're going to look at your hearing and your vision and your physical capabilities. And what they are supposed to do is figure out which device works for you in your lifestyle. Basically, most of the devices are going to have computer synthesized speech, which is what you're going to hear on the iPad, the iTouch, which you can get on your own computer. Then you have a choice of, do I want to get on the internet? Do I want to do things? And as Jen just mentioned, your orbit often shrinks as ALS progresses and even on a ventilator. So is getting on the internet real important to you? Is is being able to surf the web real important to you? And if it is, then you know that you want a device that can do that. These are just different devices that are out there. A lot of them are touchscreen devices now, like the iPad, but they also have an external keyboard that you can add on. Okay, they come in different weights, different sizes, different shapes, but most of them do all the same thing, which is communicate and surf the web. But a lot of people, especially those on ventilators, need the more sophisticated systems called an eye gaze unit. And I'm going to just go ahead for 1 second. These are eye gaze units. The premise is this is the communication device, and this is a camera that's attached to it. And it gets put right in front of you. And what you do is you need just to move your eyes, and that camera is tracking your retina. And when you dwell on a letter with your eyes, it types that letter for you. Okay, and then you move on. You set the timing. You don't also, some people, instead of dwelling, they blink. But again, I think that's fatiguing. But that's your choice. You can blink or dwell for the eye gaze units. Okay. With the eye gaze units, you can still surf the web. You can send emails. You can do other things. What you can't do is move around. Okay, that camera has to get your retina. Okay, so if you slide down in your chair and you need to be repositioned, the camera, you're probably going to have to recalibrate the unit again, meaning trying to capture your eyes with the camera. Okay, a lot of the units do allow you some wiggle room. When they first came out, you couldn't move your head at all. Like you had to stay so still. Now with some of the units, you can move in and out of camera range and come back, and it'll, instead of recalibrating, it'll capture your eyes again. Wonderful units, but you can't, going back to what I said before, there has to be a medical necessity. You can't get an eye gaze before you need an eye gaze. Insurance won't pay for it. So what some of the companies did is they came up, oh, sorry, I want to go this way. They came up with a unit like this that you can add on the eye gaze when you need it. That's something new, that's less than 2 years old. So you can get a communication device from insurance, and then you can add the eye gaze unit on when you need it. Okay. So that's the part, this is the part that's added on right here. Now some of the eye gaze units, you can see this one doesn't have, this one has the camera that's encapsulated, so it protects the camera. This camera is just hanging out. It can be bumped. It can fall off. Can get dust in it. So you have to think about these things. And the difference is that's $9,000 and that's $16,000. So you're not talking about something cheap either, which is why insurance will only pay for it when it's an absolute necessity. Okay. So what if you want a device but you're not quite eligible for the eye gaze unit yet? Because as a speech pathologist would have to write a report to say that the only movement Joe has is his eyes. He can't use anything else. If he can use something else, it's going to be rejected. So a lot of times accessing is a big issue. You can access a communication device or a computer, I'm going to say or a computer, through something called a switch, which is indirect selection. So basically, this is a switch. And when I press the switch, software on my machine starts scanning. It goes row, 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 sort of what I did with Sally. Only you're doing it with a switch. You hit your switch, it goes column, 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 and you hit your switch till it comes to the letter that you want. Okay? That's a switch access. It's a lot slower than using direct selection, which is your hand or your eyes. But for some folks, it's the only option. Okay? Or you can use, well, I'll go back, sorry. So switch access is also dependent on somebody having consistent, reliable muscle movement. So the switch this gentleman's using is actually called an EMG switch. So he's using it through a twitch here, but you could move it here, you could move it here, wherever you have movement. Okay, so switch access is always dynamic. It's usually changing because the disease is changing. But there are many, many different switches on the market. And then some people will use a head mouse system until they can get to the eye gaze. A head mouse is basically a camera that's mounted on a laptop or a desktop, and the user wears a dot between their eyes. And so as they move their head around, the camera is watching where that dot is. And then I dwell on that letter, and it types that letter for me. Okay. There are several different head mouse companies, but about 2 years ago, some researchers from Harvard came out with some freeware called cameramouse.com. And what it does is it takes your existing webcam and makes it into a head mouse. And almost every new computer has a webcam in it. So that's free, and free is my favorite word. So if you're thinking about a head mouse, before you spend $500 or more on a head mouse, try camera mouse, see if it's something that'll work for you. And then mounting the equipment, okay, to the wheelchair, depending on what you're getting. Even an iPad can be mounted on a wheelchair, right here. I mean, that iPad, $600, give or take. But as I said, if you shatter it, it's useless to you. So consider mounting it. This one has this is an iPhone, but it's strapped to his leg. But the iPad mounted here, just on a gooseneck. There are different companies selling mounts now for the iPad to protect it, and even laptops. You can mount a laptop to a computer. If you're not going to mount it to the wheelchair, think about maybe just getting a prop up for your desk. Okay? Do you really want to be holding something that heavy for so long? All right? But basically, mounts are something that keep your technology safe and usually affixed to your wheelchair. If you're going through insurance will pay for one mount. Okay? So then you have to decide, do I want a mount on my wheelchair, or do I want what they call, this is a rolling mount. So the rolling mount goes from place to place, but it's not affixed to your wheelchair, or then you get it affixed to your wheelchair. Some people have taken the option, because if Medicare would do this, it would make our lives so much easier. There's a $200 part that'll transfer the mount from the wheelchair to a desktop mount, but they won't pay for that $200 part. But if you pay for it yourself, you'll have two mounts. Okay, one mount per claim. And you get one claim for a communication device every 5 years. Okay, it's not like we could get you a device and then you say, oh, I don't like it, or I've changed my mind. So a lot of times people will use mainstream technology until they need the device from their insurance company. Okay. So we've already talked a little bit about this, but Medicare, as long as this is a medical necessity, will pay 80% of the allowable after your yearly DME deductible. It's considered durable medical equipment. Susan, what's the DME deductible now? $135 a year? Yeah. Okay, $150 a year. Okay. So they'll pay 80% after you've paid out your deductible. Well, that's true. And then you have the 20%. What's your 20% option? Hopefully you have secondary insurance. Because if you're looking at an eye gaze unit at $15,000, that puts a huge 20% burden if you don't have coverage. Okay. With private insurance, it depends on your durable medical equipment rider. You need to find out, what is my durable medical equipment coverage? And that durable medical equipment would mean wheelchairs, commodes, canes, walkers, wheelchairs, anything falls under durable medical, including communication devices. Okay. And Medicaid will vary from state to state. I can't even tell you how Pennsylvania Medicare is doing, except horrible. So that's a big wait. That's about a 6-month wait for Medicaid to pay for these devices. When is it not covered? If somebody's in hospice care, or for those that live in nursing homes, because you don't want to talk in a nursing home, okay? And so you're also not going to get a wheelchair in a nursing home. Sorry to tell you that too. That's not covered. So I wanted to mention a little bit about locked-in syndrome, because as I mentioned, I've been here for many, many years and worked with many of our pals. And they often will tell me, what's my next option? What happens if I can't use my eyes? Or what kind of technology is out there? And the answer, and I'll talk about it a little bit, is not a lot. Most of it's in research. But there are two different types of locked-in syndrome. There is just what they call LIS, which is locked-in syndrome, the absence of movement except for eye movement. Then there's total locked-in syndrome, which is the absence of movement including eye movement. Okay, so you have two different locked-in syndromes. As Jen mentioned, hopefully advanced directives will be in place before somebody becomes locked in. You want to know what are your options, and you want to make decisions before you cannot communicate anymore. Statistically, we don't know how many people end up with locked-in syndrome. There is no figure that I can say to you. But we talk about it because it can happen. And I talk about it from a technology standpoint because there's very little that technology can offer right now. What they can offer is research-only brainwave computer devices, also called BCIs. Okay? BCIs started in the 70s, and what you will often see, even in mainstream media, is the monkey moving a robot arm with his thoughts. I mean, that was the start of BCI, was for robotics. Then it moved into communication. So brain-computer interfaces are only in research at this moment. Okay, there are two different types of brain-computer research out there. There's implanted devices, and then there's skull cap devices. Implanted devices are implanted in the language part of your brain, and I do have a picture, and I'll warn you before I put it up. The skull caps are basically electrodes all over the skull that are in almost like a bicycle's racing cap, and they come out. If anyone's ever had a sleep study, it's similar to that, into a ponytail, and then everything is plugged into a computer. Basically with BCI, what I hear all the time is, so I think and it types for me. No, not at all. What you want is you think, but you still need that software that I mentioned on the computer, scanning for you. Row, 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 column, column, column. Basically, the brain-computer interface becomes a switch. Okay, but you're not thinking and it's typing. All right, you're thinking and using the software available. So, oops, sorry, that's the warning. That's the implanted BCI. This is actually the brain right here. They're planting the BCI on the brain. Okay, and this stays here. These wires get screwed in to a nut that is permanently fixed to his skull. And then when you want to turn on the BCI, you screw in that box on the top of his head. Okay. The invasive BCI is only being done in two places, Atlanta and Boston. They've only implanted one person with ALS. Basically, they've been concentrating on this with people who've had brainstem stroke. So the research is being done. I know it's not at a pace that people want, but it's being done. The problem also with this is putting somebody with ALS under surgery for 12 hours under general anesthesia, which is why a lot of ALS patients have been excluded from this study. Okay. But then you have the external BCI, which are all these electrodes into the cap. The cap is into the computer, and that subject is using the software on the computer to make selections. Okay. So you need both of these research projects, the implanted and the external, have criteria that you have to meet. It's like Dr. Gregory mentioned about research studies. There's criteria you have to meet. There's IRBs that have to be done. It's not like we can just take anybody and say, okay, you're going to be a great candidate. Okay. But the external BCI study is being done at Hahnemann Drexel University. It's affiliated with the Wadsworth Center in New York. So there is local resources for that. The implanted, you have to live within, I believe it's a 50-mile radius of Boston or Atlanta to even be considered for the study. So I mentioned there's lots of resources on YouTube. I love YouTube. Go there if you want how to use a letterboard, or anything you want to figure out what a communication device is and you want to see it. And then for those of you that didn't get my handouts, I'm happy to forward them to you. Just send me an email. And then if you're a Twitter fan, I tweet. And then there's a blog, there's an assistive technology blog where I'll post articles about the latest BCI research or what's come out of Stanford or wherever they're doing the research. So you can always look at the blog if you want the latest information on communication. Does anyone have any questions? Did I cover everything in that quick time frame?